Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the launch of the 7th annual Lowy poll. I'm Fergus Hanson, the Director of Polling here at the Institute. And this year the poll contains the usual mix of new and tracking questions, but we also try to dig a bit deeper on a few issues like Afghanistan, the US alliance and asylum seekers. Now I'm going to run you through some of the findings quickly, then hand over to the Executive Director, Michael Wesley, who will introduce the panel, and we'll have a Q&A after that. On Afghanistan, opposition to the war this year has reached a new record high, with 59% of Australians now opposed to Australia's continued military involvement there. But we also presented Australians with a list of justifications or arguments for staying on in Afghanistan. And what was interesting was that the two arguments that are most often trotted out for staying there, that we need to support the US alliance and stop Afghanistan from becoming a safe haven for terrorists, most Australians disagreed that these were reasons to stay on. The reason that convinced most Australians was that if Australia and its allies withdrew from Afghanistan, Afghan women might have their rights seriously violated by an extremist government. And that argument even convinced a majority of opponents of the war that we needed to stay on. On the US alliance, support remains extremely high, with 82% of Australians saying it is either very important or fairly important for Australia's security, down only slightly since from the record high we recorded last year. Again, we included a follow-up question and we presented Australians with 7 different arguments about the alliance to test some of their feelings on it. And a very large majority saw the alliance, a strong alliance, as a natural extension of the many common values and ideals that we share with Americans. At the same time, they also recognised the risks entailed in the alliance, realising that it risked Australia being drawn into war in Asia that was not in its national interests. Australians were more divided over whether the alliance made us safer from attack or pressure from China, with 59% saying it did, but 39% disagreeing. But when it came down to it, Australians were clear-eyed about the practical reasons for the alliance, with a very large majority disagreeing that Australia was able to defend itself without the assistance of the United States. Maybe the most interesting finding in the poll for me was in relation to US bases in Australia. Last November at the 25th Australia-US Ministerial, both sides agreed to establish a working group to look at ways to strengthen military cooperation between the two countries. But US Secretary of Defence Robert Gates said American bases in Australia were unlikely because he didn't want to create political difficulties for his Australian counterparts. Well, it seems from these results that the politicians, or the people, might be ahead of the politicians on this issue, with 55% in favour of allowing the United States to base its military forces here in Australia. On asylum seekers, again a high proportion of Australians said they were concerned about unauthorised asylum seekers coming here by boat, although this was again down slightly since last year. The Lowy poll is now in its 7th year, and one of the trends that we've been able to pick up over this period is the steady erosion in support for taking aggressive action to deal with climate change. Support for the most aggressive form of action, in this case to deal with global warming, has slipped from 68% in 2006 down to 41% today. Meanwhile, support for the intermediate proposition that global warming is should be addressed but its effects will be gradual has almost doubled, and support for the most sceptical position has nearly tripled. And it's not as if, and this is also reflected in our foreign policy goals question, where people saying that tackling climate change is a very important foreign policy goal has slipped from 75% support in 2007 down to less than 50% this year, a 29-point drop. And it turns out this drop in support isn't because people think the government is doing a good job dealing with the issue. 75% of Australians say the government is doing a poor job addressing climate change. But perhaps most ominously for the government is an erosion in support for paying to deal with climate change. This year, 39% of Australians said they weren't prepared to pay anything at all extra on their electricity bill to help solve climate change, almost double the proportion from 2008. The last big issue I want to look at is Indonesia, and the poll was taken before the recent controversy over live cattle exports. The last time we asked this series of questions was in 2006, and tellingly, attitudes are basically the same, mired in distrust and suspicion. On a 0 to 10 scale, where 0 meant strongly disagree and 10 meant strongly agree, the statement Indonesia is essentially controlled by the military received a 6.9, Indonesia is a dangerous source of Islamic terrorism, 6.5, and Australia is right to worry about Indonesia as a military threat, 6.1. There's a lot of other interesting questions on WikiLeaks, the intervention in Libya, and a range of other questions, but I might leave that to the panel and the Q&A, and I'll hand over to my boss and the Executive Director, Dr. Michael Wesley, to introduce the panel.
Well, Fergus, thank you very much for that. I think this is a fascinating poll, and congratulations. I think it shows some really important things about Australians' attitudes to the world we live in. I would like now to invite our three panellists to join me on the stage. We have with us today Senator Russell Trood, Senator from Queensland. Russell is a former colleague of mine from Griffith University who has been a prominent commentator and parliamentarian on foreign policy issues. I'd like to invite Laura Tingle, political editor with the Australian Financial Review and a long-time commentator on politics within Australia for that newspaper. And I'd like to invite Bob Carr, former journalist, former Premier of New South Wales, long-time commentator on international affairs, to join us as well. Bob, Laura, Russell, welcome. Thank you for joining us this morning. Yep. Bob, I might start with you and just ask you about polling itself. Exercises like this, why is polling important? And should public opinion on questions such as climate change, the US alliance and so on, should it be a big shaper of how we conduct our foreign policy?
I think any professional is going to be very concerned about the prospect of foreign policy being shaped by public opinion. I mean, that would send tremors of fear up and down the spine and through the guts of any diplomat. First, the limitations of polling. Polling is a snapshot. And a poll can be shaped by what is in the headlines or what is roaring out of the radio that particular day. It's a snapshot. Politicians have got to be cautioned about taking polling too literally, because it is a snapshot. Nonetheless, there are two parts of polling that are valuable, and you've settled on them in this. First, tracking, showing changes over time. That is valuable. That is when polling is not simply a snapshot. And second is argument testing. As Premier, I've got to say, a bit of data that says, a bit of data produced by the party, electricity privatisation, for example. We've tested every argument to get people to have the sort of results you saw up here, the 70% support. No argument works in any form. The electorate is repelled by the notion, Liberal voters as much as Labor voters. Argument testing is very, very useful. And that's what you've done by putting propositions to people about Indonesia, for example. And I think that with the tracking is the most useful bit of aspect of the research you've presented.
Laura, can I move on to you and ask you about foreign policy generally, or international affairs, and the role it plays in the domestic political mix in Australia? Do you think it does play a significant role in Australia, and is this greater or less than in other countries that we compare ourselves to?
Well, I think that foreign policy, the role it plays in domestic politics, comes through through perceptions of competence of government, through questions about security and threats to the country, and I think also an economic opportunity. And I think also, if you look at the history of Australian political debate about foreign policy, often ideology, whether it's the Cold War being the classic example. At the moment, if you think about it, the sorts of issues that are high on the agenda in a foreign policy sense really revolve around Afghanistan, and issues that I would say are actually extensions of the domestic political debate, particularly asylum seekers. I think you have to look at asylum seekers as an issue about the domestic debate, just as live cattle export are really an extension of the domestic debate. I mean, there's an expectation now that somehow Australians can influence and control how another country's industry works. Having said all of that, what does it mean for the way it influences things? I think in general it doesn't have a huge impact in the domestic political stage at the moment. Afghanistan does, it worries people, but I don't think it's one of those things that really features. For example, Julia Gillard famously came in as Prime Minister last year saying she didn't have a passion for foreign policy. I don't think she still has a passion for it, but what she has done, according to some of the people who are watching her closely at the official level, is that she is starting to incorporate foreign policy strategy into her thinking about domestic politics. And the fact that you can do that over a 12-month period says a lot about the relatively small role foreign policy plays in Australian politicians' strategic approach.
Okay. Russell, from your point of view, do you think foreign policy opinions in Australia are basically bipartisan, are equally held by both sides? Are they becoming more partisan over time?
I think there's a general consensus within the Australian community about the kind of orientation, if you like, of Australia. That is to say, where there is, across the main political parties, there is a view that we should be closely aligned with the United States. There is a view that we should engage effectively with Asia. There is a view that we should give foreign aid, although it's interesting that the poll you have here about the proportion that people think we're actually giving in terms of foreign aid. So I think there's a kind of general spectrum across which there is a broad range of agreement about what our foreign policy, broad foreign policy objectives should be. And of course, against the political parties, there are two things in the poll which I think are interesting about this. One is, of course, there is a consensus against those in government about the engagement in Afghanistan, but it's clear that is increasingly at odds with community perceptions. And also, I think, in relation to asylum seekers, there is clearly a community view that there is a problem here and that it needs to be addressed. However, effectively governments may or may not be doing that. But having said that there's a kind of broad orientation, I do think there are differences at margins. And for example, there is clearly a difference of view in relation to Africa at the moment, to the extent to which Australia should engage in Africa. There is a difference of view, perhaps over the Security Council bid, things of that kind. So the country seems to be of one mind as to the general direction we should be taking, but on particular issues there are significant differences, I think. Okay.
Thanks, Russell. Look, let's go to some of the specific findings of the poll. Laura, I'd like to go back to you and ask you for some comments on some of these climate change figures. As Fergus showed us, we are now at a 41% figure against taking tough action now. For tough action now, down 5 points from last year, 27 points from 2006. 39% against paying through their electricity bills for tough action, and 75% saying the government isn't doing a good job. What's going on here? How do you interpret these results?
Well, if you unbundle the climate change argument, there's the argument about science, which seems to have been going backwards in the last couple of years, with a lot of sceptics coming out and questions raised about the whole science process. You've got questions about the effectiveness of the actual mechanisms being proposed, whether you agree with taxes or cap and trade systems, whatever. There are a lot of questions that the government doesn't seem to be able to answer about that. So I think the combination of that means that the reason you're doing it and the method you're choosing are both under attack, but yet we have leapt forward into a position where we're proceeding anyway. The government really wanted to come back to the science and re-argue the science, and I think the problem is that because nobody's listening to them, because there's so much scepticism now about this issue, they can't go back and argue it again, so they're just having to press forward. It's now becoming an industry policy issue, if you like. There is this resentment about having to pay at a time when a lot of households are under cost of living pressures. So we're in this sort of strange world where the government is leading by default, not because they're actually persuading anybody, but they're leading because they have to keep going. So I think we'll end up in a position where probably the legislation will get through and people will have to reassess their views once that's happened. But it's not, there's this strange disconnect between the political debate and the fact that both the science and the methodology are now regarded very sceptically by a lot of people.
Bob, I'd like to bring you in here. 2006, 68% of Australians supported strong action on climate change, irrespective of the cost. 68%. Has the government missed a policy window to actually act meaningfully on this? Will we look back on 2006, 2007 as the opportunity for acting?
No, I've got a different view here. I'm going to be unabashedly partisan, but I'm going to challenge Laura and her colleagues to be more critical in examining a political party that gets away with a lot in Canberra. That's the Green Party. Australia would have a carbon trading scheme had not the Green Party, in the pursuit of perfection over progress, blocked it when it came to a vote in the Senate in December 2009. Moreover, they not only blocked it when it came to a vote, but they voted earlier to delay it by committing the ETS legislation to examination by a parliamentary committee. During that process, and it was an interesting process, during that process, the climate change deniers or sceptics within the coalition, Nick Minchin was one, got organised, and they hollowed out what had been a political consensus for action on climate change. Don't forget that if John Howard had won the 2007 election, we would have had an ETS. During the delay forced by the Green Party, however, that consensus was eroded, and climate change deniers and sceptics were able to change the policy of the coalition. So I think the Green political party, the Green Party, I keep calling them that, sort of the Greens. I remember the editor of the Sunday Telegraph once annoyed me. He had an article about the Greens and where their preferences would go. Under my photo, he had a caption, Labor leader, Premier Bob Carr. Under a photo, the caption for the Greens was illustrated by a photo of a koala. I rang her up and said, "Now listen, we're talking about a political party here, not a group of nature conservationists, a political party." I think the core of this delay has got to be sheeted home to the Greens, who voted with the coalition to delay it while scepticism grew apace, and then to do it in December 2009. And that's very, very significant. Another factor I'd throw into the mix, just ceasing to be partisan for a moment, another factor I'd throw into the mix is what has happened internationally. Not only Copenhagen, but the failure of cap and trade in the US Senate. Don't forget that in 2008, both candidates for the presidency were supporters of cap and trade. John McCain's name had been on legislation in the US Senate to introduce a cap and trade system. He was in a different camp from his colleague in the White House who'd supported direct action rather than cap and trade. The defeat of support for cap and trade within the US Senate, I think, figures very, very significantly in having Australians now regard bold action on climate change as not a serious policy option.
I think you're obliged to allow me to be partisan as well.
Please.
Well, I don't want to be particularly partisan, but I think...
And you can't defend the Greens.
No,
Russell,
absolutely not.
That's what I thought he was going to do.
Given that I'm about to leave the Senate as a result of the Greens taking one of my seat, then I'm unlikely to you're right about the Greens. They're the perfectionist party, and they may still sink the present arrangements to try and reach a consensus. But I agree with you, Bob, that it's the change in the international climate, and particularly after Copenhagen, that changed people's views. But I also think that this is a slightly partisan view, which is that I actually think there was a want of political courage on the part of Prime Minister Rudd at the time. And I think at the time he dumped the agreement, he actually had quite a lot of support within the community for the proposal, and had he decided, because he had all the triggers he needed for a double dissolution election, he could have made an argument more compellingly, he could have made a more convincing argument about winning it, and I think had he done so, he may well have secured the trading scheme that he actually wanted. So I actually think that part of the problem here is the unwillingness of the government to actually prosecute its case effectively.
Yeah, I think that Prime Minister Rudd saw it defeated in the Senate at a time when he detected a decline in support for bold action. And I was on this review with John Faulkner and Steve Bracks of the mistakes that led to the last election result from the Labor Party perspective. It became clear to us that Kevin's difficulty was that he copped the defeat in the Senate, inflicted by the Greens and the shift in the coalition's position, without having an alternative. And one alternative would have been to have said, we find this very unsatisfactory, we're going to recommit it to the Senate at the first opportunity, but in the meantime we are going to do the following. Take the New South Wales greenhouse gas reduction scheme, which applies to the output of power stations, and have it apply to power stations right across Australia. So we're dealing with the most significant source of greenhouse gas. To have gone on to have announced an initiative on agriculture, to have had 2 or 3 other elements. Instead, the electorate, 5 months after that defeat in the Senate, found Kevin Rudd on the defensive in a hospital corridor, having to respond to a report in the Sydney Morning Herald in April 2010, and having to admit that the government wasn't proceeding. And it was that sideways sliding away from what he declared in this room was the greatest moral issue of our time, that I think antagonised the electorate. But let's not overlook that the original sin, the crime, was the opportunism of the Greens.
Isn't just I'm not going to be partisan, but isn't the interesting question in all of this now, given all that you've both said, that the Greens are now in this position where last time their actions were sort of hidden by the fact that Labor was targeting the coalition and what its view was on climate change, because it was trying to stonker Malcolm Turnbull. This time round, what the Greens are doing is right out there. People have voted for the Greens because they think they are pure. If they knock off the carbon tax and the ETS this time, it's going to be a very different knock-on effect in politics than it was last time. And it's going to be different for the Greens, it's going to be different for the coalition, and it's going to be different for the government. In an environment where you've got 3 parties scrabbling for moral and political authority, and with the government not having a lot, I think it's going to be fascinating to watch how that plays out.
Yeah, it's an exquisite dilemma for the Green Party now. If they say it's not good enough, we're doing it in again, there'll be a lot of criticism, including from within their ranks, that they've been too idealistic and impractical, and they've really doomed it forever. If they sign up to it, they've got to defend a scheme which has got subsidies for the power sector and emissions-intensive export competing industries and all the other industry policy concessions.
Well, welcome to politics.
Yep, that's right.
Well, it strikes me actually that Australia is unique in the level and partisanship of the debate over climate change among countries we like to compare ourselves to. It seems that this issue has more prominence in the domestic debate in Australia than in pretty much any other country you can think of. Do you think, all of this argy-bargy around it is actually leading to that slow growth of public cynicism about the issue? That people are starting to become sick of hearing about it, they're becoming cynical about governments and political parties on this issue?
The great irony, I suppose, was that while everybody keeps saying, Julia, you said there wouldn't be a carbon tax, I don't know how many of you actually remember her saying that, but I certainly don't remember the ETS being a huge issue in the election campaign. She'd said she'd do something about it, but everybody thought it was sort of done and dusted for the time being. It just wasn't high profile. So the great irony is an issue that wasn't a huge issue in the campaign itself, but obviously played a huge role in the transition of prime ministers, is now this litmus test, I think, for her, and that is where the sort of nub of the controversy lies. The carbon tax and climate change is now become sort of what's the word I'm looking for? A proxy for the whole Julia Gillard question. A lot of it isn't about climate change anymore, I don't think. It's about her and it's about credibility.
Yeah. To the point where it would be better for the continuing health of the Labor Party, for the Labor Party as an institution, to go down to defeat having put an ETS in place than to go down to defeat because it wobbled on the issue again. And that captures the sort of dogged determination of the government to get this into place and to live with the consequences.
It may do so.
Look, let's move on to the relationship with the United States. Bob, you're the logical person to throw the first question to. Some very interesting figures here. 81% support for ANZUS, saying it's a very important part of Australia's security. 55% supporting US basing in Australia. Do these figures surprise you? And let me throw one more figure at you. Reasons for staying in Afghanistan, only 38% saying we should be in Afghanistan because it helps us maintain the alliance. How do you read some of these figures? What's the general public mood on the US alliance, and where does it come from?
Well, it just confirms this great truth about Australian public opinion: overwhelming support for the alliance, but a not uncritical approach to America. And I remember debates on my side of politics as to whether you could say, this is in the early days of Kevin Rudd's leadership, we continue to be opposed to the Australian commitment to Iraq, but we're unwavering in our support for the American alliance. And I remember I said in one discussion, it's an absolutely secure position. The Australian people are with you on this. They understand it. They recognise that you can say this is a war without strategic justification and with a whole load of risks. But on the other hand, please understand that we are unwavering in our support for this alliance as a linchpin of Australian security. And this would reflect an enormous common sense in the Australian people. This is an educated public about a great strategic truth. A standout feature of this poll, though, is the support for American bases.
Russell, were you surprised by that figure?
Well, I am. I must say I agree with Bob completely that figure in support of American bases surprised me. I must say, I don't know whether it uniquely reflects your sample, but I suspect it doesn't. But that's much higher than I would have anticipated it would be. And the other point about the alliance, I think, is that while people understand it and regard it as very important, they also understand, I think it comes through the figures as well, that if you want the benefits of the alliance, then you've got to do things to maintain it. You've got to do, in other words, pay your dues. And I think that Bob's point about sophistication, I think, is underscored by the fact that this is not a free ride. That if you want to be in an alliance, if you want to get the benefit of American deterrence, then at some point you have to recognise that you have to divvy up and make your contribution to the alliance. And I think that comes through these figures as well.
Laura, can I draw you out on that point? It appears that a large proportion of those that we surveyed suggested that the alliance with the United States does increase our risks of being drawn into a major war in the region, possibly with China, and yet support for the alliance remains strong. How do you interpret that? Are people pragmatic and hard-headed about what the alliance to the United States entails?
Well, a couple of things, and maybe I could just start by noticing in Figure 10 the changing importance of ANZUS. And it's interesting to me that you've got a much stronger support for ANZUS in the last couple of years than you did, say, in the mid-noughties, when there was actually a lot more in-your-face discussion about America under Bush, and there was much more focus on the personal relationship between leaders, and there's a lot more focus on it. Going to your question, Michael, I think it's interesting that you do have this quite interesting divide in the way people see things. Yes, they think we have to pay for it by something like bases, but at the same time they're more supportive of the alliance at a time when it's not necessarily as seen as a period of great risk internationally. I mean, there wasn't a period of great risk 3 or 4 years ago, but that sense of terrorism risk and the world being a dangerous place, I think, was much stronger. But you do have people peeling off layers and now having this very interesting view of Afghanistan, which is that it's about protecting women in Afghanistan. It's not about the relationship. So there is a really interesting and sophisticated breaking up of those issues, I think.
I wonder, Michael, whether or not this rise in support reflects a view about the American presidency.
This is what I was wondering about.
And
it's a more benign
yeah,
sort of...
And Obama is a more, to many, might be seen as a more likable individual than was President Bush. And
less belligerent, I suppose, internationally.
People feel more comfortable in that circumstance.
Bush was detested in every category of Australian public opinion. There was no warmth for him in business boardrooms around the city. There's no warmth for him on your side of politics, Russell. I think that's... I think
apart from the Prime Minister, Prime Minister was pretty...
Absolutely, no, I stand corrected.
And the Foreign Minister.
I was thinking, and the Foreign Minister, I was just thinking of Nick Minchin's comments the last few days. Yeah. You're absolutely right to correct me on that. There was tremendous warmth, but none anywhere else. And this is Figure 10 is absolutely a snapshot of views about the embodiment of US leadership.
Now, just on that, and this is for anyone to comment on, there's another intriguing finding in these numbers. 55% of people, when we asked them which is the most significant economy in the world, 55% said China. Exactly the same figure as we found last year. Only this year we asked the following question. Compared to 10 years ago, do you feel that Western influence around the world has increased, decreased, or has it stayed about the same? 47% said it's increased, Western influence around the world. So all of the pessimism about the United States, the rise of China, doesn't seem to be reflected in these numbers here. Any comments on that? Anyone want to have a go at interpreting those?
Well, I confess confusion at that point. I really do, because I would have thought that the weight of expert opinion or commentary opinion is of the kind that certainly it's acknowledged that China has the second largest economy, depending on how you measure it, of course. But I doubt most people would say that that Western views or Western civilization remains quite as strong as it once was. It seems to be, in many ways, under threat from a range of places. So what this means, I'm not sure. Whether or not it could be perhaps people feeling comfortable about their own circumstances, although I'm surprised if that were the case. I'm at a loss to explain that, I have to say.
I think the debate about American decline and about Western decline is only now gathering pace. You can see it in scholarly circles. You can see it reflected in the political deadlock in Washington about dealing with this awesome growth in debt. America's divided government, a constitution devised in the constitution written in the 1780s, the oldest written constitution in the world, showing up some limitations when it comes to the sort of decisive, perhaps Thatcherite action required to correct the imbalances in the American budget. you could really say that it's only in the last 6 months that attention to American declinism has begun to get the attention it deserves in Australia.
Okay.
And it'll be interesting if that trend continues, evidence of that continues, to see whether it begins to feed into these polls next year.
Okay, let's go to some of the figures about some Asian countries. And Russell, I might ask you to lead off here. 75% of our poll respondents said that China's growth is good for Australia, but 41% said that China could be a military threat to Australia in the next 10 years. What's going on there?
Well, I think there's some, when I look at these polls, there seems to me to be some ambivalence about China in the Australian consciousness.
Yep.
I think on the one hand, you're right that there is a recognition that China is important to Australia's economic health. That's true. But there is some, and there is also a statistic which alludes to the fact that Australians see China as wanting to dominate the region as well. But on the other hand, there seems to be a relatively relaxed view about whether or not China is a direct threat to Australia, and the most significant category in your poll about what we should do about this, if anything, is the 41% who people who say, well, we shouldn't be thinking about challenging China. So there's a bit of schizophrenia here,
Yes.
I think, about China and what people think about it. And the thing that's particularly interesting, particularly if you were to compare it with a country like Indonesia, is that in terms of the capacity of, or what Australians think about whether or not China can act in a responsible way in the international system, then China actually rates higher than Indonesia, and somewhere between Russia, just above Russia. So this is interesting, and I think it reflects the fact that Australians recognise China is very important to our future, but they're not necessarily see it as a direct threat to our future, our military threat anyway.
I suppose, and also just going back to that earlier question about the 47% who thought that Western influence was greater. I don't think we've really had a discussion in Australia yet about how China works, and this sort of sense of some sort of underlying threat in, it's growing and it's getting big, and well, that could be really bad. We think it could be really bad because it's got a really big army for a start, but we don't really know what Chinese ambitions are and how they will affect us. So I think there is, on the one hand, there is an underlying recognition that there is some sort of threat there. Economically, it's good for us, and in the middle there's sort of a bit of not even an uncertainty, just a lack of knowledge and understanding of how China works and how it's evolving as well, which leaves people feeling a bit ambivalent about it.
And just the point that's also in the poll about the view in relation to Chinese investment, about which there is anxiety. So we like to take advantage of the economic benefits of the relationship. On the other hand, we're not absolutely encouraged or absolutely comfortable with the extent to which manifested in terms of investment that's a good thing for the Australian economy.
Yeah. The interesting thing is going to be how this polling data influences the debate in Australia at the present time about how we should respond to China's strategic rise, China's rise in a strategic as well as an economic sense. I think some people in Australian politics on both sides have been a bit too ready to encourage America to take a somewhat truculent response to what Gareth Evans has described as great powers doing what great powers do. That is, developing a military to match their economic strength. And it'll be interesting to see how this figures in that debate about whether we should be goading America to think in terms of a military response to China's rise, instead of doing what I think is a more sensible policy, one rooted in Australia's interest, and that is encouraging America at every opportunity to maximise the areas of peaceful cooperation, to find a way of accommodating and shaping what will inevitably happen, a greater Chinese military presence in the region.
Could I just,
Sure.
just as an anecdote, which sort of shows how all of these things play out if you're sitting around the federal cabinet table, when there was that surge of Chinese investment proposals for mining projects a couple of years ago, we had a very new Labor government led by Mandarin-speaking Kevin Rudd, but suddenly the cabinet was confronted with this terrible dilemma about whether they actually approved these various mining investments, and a lot of them were confronted by the aggression or assertiveness, whichever way you want to look at it, of the Chinese when they're after something, and it was it really sort of gave them a bit of a cause to stop and say, "Gosh, they're quite forceful, aren't they?" And to also worry about whether they would really scare off investment or not. Now, I think the upshot of it was that they ended up coming out of that process going, well, no, we can actually set our own terms, and the Chinese expect us to do that. But nonetheless, it was a bit of a learning curve for them to actually see how that works, realpolitik, if you like, works in practice in dealing with the Chinese. And I think there's probably a lot of that has to go on in Australia.
Yeah, that's an accurate description of the process of what went on since Chinelco, after Chinelco emerged. Of course, the poll doesn't pick up what makes this a somewhat neuralgic issue, and that is Chinese investment proposals emerging from state-owned companies or from sovereign wealth funds, and entities in which a PLA general or a princeling, son or daughter of a prominent Chinese communist, sit prominently on the boards. And that presents it. So that's the reason the government adopted a policy, I think in early 2008 or 9, about a different Foreign Investment Review Board treatment of such investment proposals. Not just from China, of course, but applying to a sovereign wealth fund investment from Singapore or from the Gulf.
But we did go through these periods of anxiety about the extent to which a country is investing, as we did in relation to Japan, of course, 20 years ago. But perhaps this reflects a measure of sophistication in the Australian community about understanding Bob's point about the source of this money, and that's something about which we are uncomfortable.
Now I'm going to open it up to audience questions. If you do have a question, please wait until the microphone makes its way to you. I have one more while people think of their question. Interesting results on Indonesia in particular that I'd like to draw out, but I'm really interested in this figure on WikiLeaks. We asked people whether they thought on balance WikiLeaks was more of a good thing or a bad thing. 62% thought it was more of a good thing. 27% thought it was more of a bad thing. Does this, I mean, in your opinion, betray a bit of a distrust of government, that we've got to get in and know all their secrets?
Well, I think usual hostility of Australians towards government, perhaps, and perhaps Assange has been seen in some quarters as a bit of a hero, and I think that probably explains it. I'm more interested in the Indonesia question, because I actually think I'm actually profoundly disturbed by those figures. I know they're entirely consistent with polling over the last few years, but the fact that Australians, they on the list of countries that one should trust internationally, you list Indonesia below Russia and China, on the equivalent with Egypt.
And just above Iran.
And just above Iran. And that Australians seem not to understand that, in fact, the military's been out of power in Indonesia for quite some time, 15 years, 20 years, and that it's a democracy and a very increasingly stable democracy, and that they see a threat. I actually think this is a profoundly disturbing statistic and finding in the poll, because we ought to be doing better in relation to Indonesia.
We couldn't have had more cooperation from any government than we've had from the Indonesian government when it's come to counter-terrorism. I sometimes think the Indonesians are called on to show enormous forbearance for Australian behaviour on this. If any Indonesians were saying the sort of things about Australia that Australians often say about Indonesians, we would be enormously hurt. But a drug smuggler is arrested in Bali and talkback radio spews hysterical anti-Indonesian sentiment. And I just think the Indonesians again and again show forbearance for clumsy, clodhopper Australian behaviour. We behave like yokkers and we expect them to show restraint. And I find this figure worrying. The support for Julian Assange, I know there has been exposure of American war crimes in Iraq, and he's got to be given credit for that. But if he said anything like the statement attributed to him, that he doesn't care whether the revelation of material results in the execution of a figure in Afghanistan who's been supporting the Western side, then that is shocking. And I've got little sympathy, less sympathy for him the more I hear about him. Actually, to be honest, I started with none, because I think executive government is entitled to have secrets. In a democracy, you're entitled to have material that's not publicly revealed. For example, if an Australian diplomat in Beirut or Syria is talking to someone in a position of power, a newspaper editor, a party official, an advisor to the president, and they're telling you things that are critical of the regime, that ought to be kept secret. And the Assange idea that gets flung out there, and you're not responsible if a car bomb takes out the life of the person who's been cooperating in a civilised way with our diplomats, I think that's shocking.
And I suppose I'd just finish by saying when did this actually get polled? Was it March and April? I suspect if you polled it in January and February, it might have been 82%. I think it's probably on a bit of a downward trajectory because, well, let's face it, a lot of us thought it was really great when it first started, and there were some wonderful stories about. There's a beautiful writer who's one of the American ambassadors to one of the Starns, who wrote a wonderful piece about going to a wedding, which was like Somerset Maugham. I know that's very decadent, but so I think the view of that has changed, and I would just presume that it was actually on a downward projection.
Well, I noticed that WikiLeaks the musical is about to hit our shores. So, can I invite questions from the audience? Does anyone have any issues that they'd like to raise or questions they'd like to ask? What I might, yes, gentleman, just second from the back.
Thank you. My name's Chris Edwards. I'm with the China News Channel. I guess I have a general question for all of you, which is, how concerning is it that this government seems unable to articulate its ideas and the reasoning behind them, and the policies, whether they be carbon tax or asylum seekers? They seem unable to articulate their ideas to the Australian public, and where is the message being lost?
Well, it doesn't concern me in the slightest, of course. but Laura and I happened to be speaking about this earlier, actually. But I agree, it's a profound problem from the point of view of the government, because they seem to me to be singularly unable to set a strategic direction, and many of the decisions, whether or not you agree with them or otherwise, just have been very badly handled, and they increasingly underscore the perception of catastrophe and accident prone. And I think some of the issues which have been the most difficult for governments, whether it's asylum seekers or even live cattle trade, which is another Indonesia problem, it seems to me, could have been so much better handled, and had they done so, it would have given the government a better sense, or the community a better sense of the fact that this is in fact a competent government. And I think everything it does betrays that idea that it is competent. That's a somewhat partisan view, but of course.
Well, I think what has happened now is we've got to the stage now where the media's presumption when they're looking at any issue is so how are they going to stuff this up? I just give it as one example, or we move on to where the disaster might fall in any issue. When the government announced the NBN deal with Telstra last week, which, whatever you think of the NBN, is a very significant change in Australia's telecommunications system. The Australian's website's first story was all about how much it would cost Telstra if there was a change of government and the deal was rescinded. Now, that's a reasonable enough thing, but I would have thought that readers probably wanted to know first what the actual deal was. So there is this presumption of failure now around the government, which makes everything even worse, and it makes it very hard for them to get that message out. But without a doubt, they're complete dunderheads in the way they proceed in getting those messages out, because I don't think they do have a very long-term strategic direction, and because it's not a cabinet government, they don't talk to each other and sort of work to get something together. In some ways, I think the best thing going for the government is that they do think they'll lose, which is the point that Bob made earlier. It sounds silly, but a lot of the people who want to get some good policy out there will say to you, well, we're going to lose anyway, so we might as well try to do something decent before we go. So they might actually, that's the only possible counter I can see at the moment to this sort of terrible political...
It could be described as the got a dumber wrong option and hand out the arsenic tablets.
That's right. That's right.
I think I'd say on this that so much of the policy they're pursuing is sound. For example, the clawing back of the middle class welfare and aiming for a balanced budget in the last budget, and the investment in training and the social security reforms that are going to see people eased off welfare rolls. There are too many people in this country on disability pensions, and brought back into the workforce. This is very sound policy making. But it's lost because when the government attempts to explain what it's doing, there isn't the authority or persuasion, there isn't the dash or style you'd have from a Whitlam, a Hawke or a Keating. When those guys went on AM in the morning or did a press conference or did an extended interview on laws or somewhere, when they were at their best, you could feel public opinion shifting as they got their arguments across. And they weren't using cue cards, they were using fresh arguments, beyond cliche. They didn't use cliches, they were introducing fresh arguments, using them in interesting ways, and they're unpredictably good at their best. There's not a sense of that.
There's no danger, I think. I can't work out, for example, why the government doesn't just say, look, we said one thing before the election about climate change, we've had to do something different, but we always said we'd try to do it. If you don't like it by election time, you can vote us out. I mean, which is something that John Howard said about the GST. Why not just say it? Instead you get this mincing about pussyfooting stuff, and it doesn't portray any confidence in your own judgment or any courage of your convictions.
Yeah, a bit of dash and a bit of colour. Now, I'm not saying, I hate this suggestion that there was a golden age when governments, Labor governments, got these things right. I think of Keating's wrong call when he said, yes, we are in a recession, but it is a recession we had to have. It was appalling. He should have used his dash, his panache in a different way. He should have said, yes, we are in recession, but it's a recession the world's dragged us into. But at his best, he would have used an argument like that. He would have said, look, listen, the dogs are barking, but the caravan's moved on. This is a new political reality, and this is what we're doing. And everyone would have steamed and
he would have been able to get angry and
go, but he would have said, get over it, as an election result, we're dealing with this and we're dealing with it in this way. So that's what I meant by authority. And I'm doing a bit of research on Gough Whitlam's career now, because he's 95, it's time to summon up the arguments. You never know when you might get a call to use them. I sent him a copy. I sent him a copy of something I'd written about him for future use. And I got a call from him. It was December the 2nd last year. And he said, it's December the 2nd. It was a phone call. That's how he started. He said, it's December the 2nd. My Austerlitz. A reference to his famous I said, I hope you're pleased with the article, Gough. He said, yes, it was very fine. And it just reminded me that there was a time when our side of politics were the advocates and the persuaders, and we said the more interesting things. Now somehow we've got to go back to that. We've got to go back to that.
I might be surprised if Gough thought the time was near to make an assessment.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately we are out of time. I do apologise if you had a question you wanted to ask our panellists. I'm I've been fascinated by this conversation. Thank you to all three of you. It has been absolutely fascinating. I want to thank each of you, Bob, Laura, Russell, for your time this morning and your candour in sharing your thoughts on our polling. And I look forward to further discussion of these poll results and, of course, our poll results next year. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our panellists this morning.